What if the darkest stories of war weren't written by enemy armies, but by the very soldiers the world believed were the good guys? For decades, classified files, forgotten testimonies, and long-buried investigations have revealed a truth few ever talk about. Even American troops fighting for freedom have moments when fear, rage, and chaos push them past the line that should never be crossed. Today, we uncover those moments, not to judge a nation, but to understand how war changes the human soul. Imagine a young American soldier, barely 20 years old, standing in the ruins of a foreign village. Smoke twists through broken windows. A dog barks somewhere in the distance. And for a moment, just a moment, he wonders if he is still the hero he thought he would be, or if something inside him has crossed a line he can never step back from. Every war has rules. Every army has boundaries. But history shows us that in the chaos of battle, even the best trained troops can lose sight of where that boundary lies. And when that happens, when fear, anger, and confusion collide, some soldiers step into a darkness that governments, historians, and even fellow veterans struggle to talk about. This story is not about blaming an entire nation or an entire army. It is not about painting American soldiers as villains. Instead, it is about those rare, but real moments when individuals caught in the fog of war made choices that broke military law and human morality. Moments that were documented, investigated, and in many cases, acknowledged by the U.S. government itself. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll explore the shadows behind the headlines events from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. These are places where the line between survival and cruelty blurred, and where a handful of actions became dark stains on otherwise heroic chapters of American military history. But before diving into specific events, we must understand one thing clearly. War distorts reality. It twists judgment. It pushes ordinary people to the edge of their humanity. And sometimes, in that pressure, terrible decisions are made not by armies, not by policies, but by individuals overwhelmed by fear and chaos. This is the story of what happens when geese go dark. A story grounded in real investigations, real testimonies, and real lessons that remind us why the laws of war exist in the first place. World War II is often remembered in black and white. Good versus evil. Liberation versus tyranny. American soldiers were welcomed across Europe as heroes, and in countless ways, they truly were. But behind the triumphant headlines, there were moments small in number, but unforgettable, when the chaos of war pushed some soldiers across a line they were never meant to cross. Sicily, 1943. The Boscari killings. It began in the heat and dust of Sicily. American forces had just landed, fighting their way inland through confusion, sniper fire, and exhaustion. Morale was shaky. Nobody knew who was a threat and who wasn't. Civilians, surrendering soldiers, spies, they all blurred together. One afternoon near an airfield called Boscari, a group of Italian and German prisoners were rounded up. They were disarmed, standing quietly under guard. The worst of the fighting had already passed. What happened next would stay buried for years. Witnesses later testified that American troops, acting without clear justification, opened fire on dozens of these prisoners. 73 men, no longer able to resist, were killed. It shocked the officers who later investigated it. It shocked the military courts that handled the aftermath. And it reminded everyone that even the good war had moments when fear and anger overpowered discipline. The U.S. Army eventually prosecuted several individuals involved, confirming that the incident did occur. The lesson was painful but real. Even in a just cause, human beings can make devastating choices. Europe, 1944-45. Crimes no one wanted to talk about as American troops pushed deeper into Europe. The situation grew more complicated. Towns celebrating liberation sat beside villages shattered by months of occupation. Tensions ran high. Alcohol was everywhere. And some soldiers, worn down by months of combat, made decisions that would haunt their units for decades. Records from military, police units and declassified court documents show that there were thousands of reported assaults and abuses committed by individual soldiers in France, Italy, and Germany. Not by entire divisions, not by policy, but by isolated individuals who took advantage of chaos, fear, and lack of supervision. Local authorities complained. Some communities asked American commanders to move certain units away. The military did investigate many cases, and some soldiers were arrested and tried. But in the fog of a massive global war, countless incidents slipped through the cracks. Again, these moments did not define the American war effort, but they remind us that victory does not erase human weakness, and liberation does not automatically guarantee moral clarity. A war of heroes, with shadows behind them. For every dark incident in World War II, there were thousands of acts of bravery and compassion. But history becomes honest only when we look at both, the light and the shadow, the triumph and the mistakes, the heroism and the moments when some soldiers stepped into darkness. And as the war moved on to new continents and new enemies, those shadows returned, sometimes even darker than before. The Korean War began with panic. Armies collapsed, civilians fled in every direction, and rumors spread faster than the bullets. American troops, many of them young, newly arrived, and completely unprepared for the chaos, were told again and again that enemy soldiers were disguising themselves as refugees. And in the middle of that fear came one of the most painful chapters in early Cold War history. July 1950, the bridge at No Gun Riot happened during the desperate first days of the war. American units were retreating south, trying to regroup while thousands of Korean civilians poured onto the same roads, families pushing carts, carrying children, running from danger they couldn't see. Near a small railroad bridge outside the village of No Gun Ri, several hundred civilians were stopped by U.S. troops. The soldiers were exhausted, overwhelmed, and unsure who might be an enemy in disguise. Then came the moment that changed everything. Survivors later said they heard aircraft overhead, then gunfire, then chaos. Panicked families rushed under the stone arches of the bridge for cover. And over the next 3 days, trapped and terrified, many civilians were shot as they tried to flee or move for safety. When the shooting finally stopped, the ground beneath the bridge was stained with a tragedy no one could understand. Not then, and not for decades. Fear, confusion, and the breakdown of judgment. What drove the soldiers to open fire? Investigations decades later painted a grim picture. Units had been warned repeatedly about disguised infiltrators. Communication between commanders was inconsistent and chaotic. Some soldiers believed they had been ordered to fire on anyone moving toward their position. Others acted out of pure fear in a battlefield they did not recognize. No one walked into No Gun Ri planning to hurt civilians. But in the fog of war, even more than in World War II, fear could override training, and split-second decisions could spiral into disaster. Acknowledgement after half a century, for nearly 50 years, the survivors' stories remained mostly unheard. Then, in the late 1990s, American journalists uncovered military documents suggesting that U.S. commanders had indeed expressed deep concerns about disguised enemy fighters among refugees. In 2001, after a full investigation, the U.S. government formally acknowledged that a large number of Korean civilians had been killed at No Gun Ri. It was not an act of policy. It was not an order to target civilians. It was a tragic breakdown in discipline, judgment, and communication during one of the most chaotic moments of the war. The lesson of No Gun Ri, the story of No Gun Ri, is not about blaming an army. It is about understanding how quickly fear can turn into tragedy when leadership collapses and uncertainty rules the battlefield. For the families who lost loved ones, the memory never faded. And for historians, No Gun Re is a reminder that even the most disciplined forces can make devastating mistakes when they can no longer tell the difference between danger and innocence. If World War II showed the first cracks, and Korea exposed the danger of fear under pressure, then Vietnam was the conflict where those cracks widened into something far darker. For many American soldiers, Vietnam was a world turned upside-down jungles hiding unseen enemies, villages that seemed friendly one day and hostile the next, and losses that built frustration like a storm cloud ready to burst. And in that storm, two of the most notorious chapters in American military history unfolded. My Lai, 1968. The massacre that shook the world. It began as a simple search and destroy mission. Charlie Company, made up mostly of young American soldiers barely out of high school, moved into the village of My Lai expecting fierce Viet Cong resistance. But when they entered the village, on March 16, 1968, they found something entirely different. Women, elders, unarmed men, small children. No weapons. No enemy fire. What happened next is one of the most painful moments in the Vietnam War. Amid confusion, anger from recent losses, and a belief later proven wrong that they were walking into a hostile stronghold, some soldiers began firing. Huts burned. Families ran in fear. And within hours, more than 500 Vietnamese civilians were dead. It was an event so shocking that when the truth began to surface a year later, many refused to believe it. But then came the photos, the testimonies, and the quiet, steady voice of helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson, who risked his life to stop the shooting and later reported what he saw. The U.S. military launched a full investigation. Officers were removed from command. Courts-martial followed. And My Lai became a turning point, a moment when America was forced to confront the darkest consequences of a war with no clear lines and no clear moral center. But My Lai was not the only shadow from Vietnam. Tiger Force, 1967. The unit nobody talked about long before My Lai became known to the world. Another story was buried deep inside the files of the 101st Airborne Division. Tiger Force. They were an elite reconnaissance unit launched into some of the most dangerous parts of the Central Highlands. For months, the unit moved from village to village, operating with an unusual level of independence. But the pressure was relentless. Casualties mounted. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Decades later, in 2003, reporters from the Toledo Blade uncovered internal military documents and veteran testimonies describing disturbing actions committed by some members of Tiger Force during 1967. According to those investigations, civilians were detained and killed without clear cause. Some soldiers took trophies such as ears, a practice strictly forbidden and condemned by the military. Reports were filed by concerned soldiers, but the full investigation was never completed at the time. These were not actions of an entire brigade, nor of the U.S. military as a whole. They were acts committed by specific individuals in extreme conditions, during a war that pushed many soldiers beyond their breaking point. When the story finally became public decades later, even veterans who served honorably were shocked. The Army reviewed the historical records, acknowledging the depth of the allegations and the internal investigations that had taken place. Tiger Force became another reminder of a hard truth. When discipline unravels, when leadership collapses, and when soldiers are isolated in a brutal environment, the boundaries of morality can erode with terrifying speed. Vietnam's lasting warning. The Vietnam War did not create darkness. It revealed what can happen when fear, exhaustion, and confusion take control of the battlefield. For every tragedy, there were thousands of American soldiers who acted with courage and restraint. Soldiers who protected civilians, followed the rules of war, and tried to keep their humanity intact in a place where humanity often seemed impossible. But the stories of my Malayan Tiger Force remain essential. Not to shame a nation, not to judge a generation, but to remind us how easily a war can swallow the very values soldiers are sworn to defend. If leadership, training, and accountability failed. By the early 2000s, the battlefields had changed. The technology was different. The uniforms were new. But the pressure, the long deployments, the constant uncertainty, the invisible enemy felt painfully familiar. And in the middle of two complicated wars, a new kind of darkness emerged. Not because of national policy, not because entire units were corrupt, but because a handful of individuals lost control of their judgment in the most stressful environment imaginable. These are the stories that forced the world and the U.S. military to confront the psychological cost of endless war. Abu Ghraib, 2004. The night the photos came out, it began with whispers inside a prison on the western edge of Baghdad. Then a few blurry photos. Then the world watched in disbelief. Abu Ghraib was supposed to be a holding facility, a place to detain suspected insurgents during the early years of the Iraq War. But in 2004, leaked photographs showed several U.S. military personnel humiliating and mistreating prisoners posing beside them, laughing, treating suffering like a twisted game. The images felt unreal, almost staged, yet they were horrifyingly authentic. What made this story even more shocking was that it didn't come from an enemy source. It came from American investigators inside the U.S. Army, who uncovered the abuse and reported it up the chain of command. Military courts acted swiftly. Multiple soldiers were court-martialed. Leaders were relieved of duty, and the U.S. government publicly acknowledged what had happened. The story of Abu Ghraib became a global symbol, not of American policy, but of what can go wrong when discipline collapses and oversight disappears inside a war zone. It was a painful lesson, but one the military used to tighten training, redefine interrogation standards, and increase accountability. Afghanistan, 2010. The kill team. If Abu Ghraib represented humiliation, the next story represented something even darker. In 2010, reports emerged from Kandahar province about a small group of American soldiers who had formed what they called the kill team. These were not orders from above. These were not actions of an entire unit. They were the private, criminal acts of a handful of individuals who went rogue in the middle of an exhausting and demoralizing war. Investigations and court documents revealed that this group staged false firefights, killed unarmed civilians, and took photographs with the bodies, acts completely forbidden and condemned by the Army. It wasn't another soldier or civilian who exposed them. It was one of their own, a young private who saw what was happening and refused to stay silent. He reported the actions, triggering a full investigation. Once again, the military responded aggressively. Court-martials, long prison sentences, immediate disciplinary actions. The kill team case shocked many Americans because it showed how a few individuals, isolated from leadership and hardened by stress, could unravel morally in a war with no clear front lines. But it also showed something else. Even in the darkest corners of the battlefield, someone still stood up, someone still chose to do the right thing. Modern wars, modern wounds. Iraq and Afghanistan were not like previous wars. They were long, emotionally draining, filled with hidden threats and moral gray zones. Most American service members served honorably, followed the rules, and protected innocent lives even at great risk to themselves. But the cases of Abu Ghraib and the kill team prove that the pressures of modern warfare can fracture judgment in dangerous ways. They are reminders of why accountability matters, why leadership matters, and why the laws of war written decades earlier still stand as a crucial guide for soldiers in the chaos of combat. As we reach the end of this journey, through some of the darkest moments in modern military history, one question rises above everything else. Why talk about these stories at all? Why reopen old wounds? Why shine a light on events that many would prefer to forget? The answer is simple: because history only protects us when it is honest. Each of these incidents, from Sicily to Iraq, reminds us that war is not just fought with weapons. It is fought with judgment, with discipline, with the fragile balance between fear and responsibility. And when that balance breaks, even the most well-trained soldiers can lose sight of the values they swore to defend. But something just as important stands beside the darkness: the courage of the people who spoke up. A helicopter pilot in Vietnam who risked his life to stop a massacre. A young private in Afghanistan who refused to join the wrongdoing around him. Investigators, journalists, commanders, and veterans who stepped forward, sometimes decades later, to say, "This happened, and it must never happen again." Their voices are proof that accountability is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of strength. And it is the reason these stories matter today. Because when a nation confronts its mistakes openly, it becomes stronger. When an army confronts misconduct inside its own ranks, it becomes more disciplined. And when the public understands the real weight that soldiers carry, compassion, not judgment, follows. Most American service members serve with honor. They protect civilians, follow the rules of war, and make impossible decisions in impossible situations. Their sacrifice should never be overshadowed by the actions of a few. But at the same time, the lessons from My Lai, No Gun Re, Abu Ghraib, the Kill Team, and other tragedies must never be erased. They remind us that human beings are vulnerable to fear and pressure, and that war is a place where those vulnerabilities can turn deadly if leadership and accountability fail. Telling these stories does not weaken the United States. It strengthens it, because a nation willing to confront its past is a nation prepared to protect its future. And that is why these shadows matter. Not to divide, but to warn. Not to condemn, but to teach. Not to shame, but to remind us all that the line between right and wrong is worth guarding, especially when the world is at war. So as we look back at the moments when some soldiers crossed the line, we also look toward a future where training is stronger, oversight is tighter, and every generation of service members carries these lessons with them. Because history's darkest chapters are not written to frighten us. They are written to guide us. And only by reading them fully, bravely, honestly, can we make sure we never repeat them.